Welcome, everyone. Clark's Island, Archaeology and Some Native American History. So I have been studying Native American artifacts in Massachusetts for the last 35 years. And I got first interested, I was on the Central Artery Urban Design Project, and I was assigned Spectacle Island. And on Spectacle Island in Boston Harbor, there's a Native American encampment, and it was called a clam midden, a midden, where artifacts are found on the edge of this island, and people visited. And I immediately learned all about the Massachusetts tribe and thousands of years of artifacts, and I got hooked on the knowledge. And then 25 years ago, I moved to Duxbury. And 20 years ago, there was a similar midden to the one I had studied on Spectacle Island in the middle of Powder Point. A friend of mine, Terry Vose, pointed it out. And then I joined the Massachusetts Archaeological Society and went to lots of lectures, got very involved in people who are local archaeologists. And the last 4 years I've spent on the Duxbury Historical Commission. One thing I want to point out is that I have no Wampanoag ancestry and no Pilgrim ancestry, and I'm not representing their cultures at all. And particularly the Wampanoag are very sensitive to other people representing their culture. And I'm just talking about the archaeology and some historical artifacts. So this talk is mainly pre-colonial with a little bit of King Philip's War in it. The history of colonial Clark's Island, you can learn about through a new book that's been published over the last year and a chapter written by James W. Baker, Clark's Island from Pilgrims to Today. And he's written mainly about the Pilgrims, the visit in 1620, the shallop, and the stories since then. And they're fascinating stories, and he's done a great job. I won't be talking about the colonial era of Clark's Island. So Native Americans moved into this area about 14,000 to 13,000 years ago. And ice sheets covered our area before that and formed Clark's Island. Native Americans moved into the Southwest 23,000 years ago. These footprints up in the corner were recently dated last year at 23,000 years. And this is the ice sheets at 21,000, 16,000, etc. So people have lived in this area a very long time. But our land was very different then. The large glacial areas took up a lot of water before they melted, and the land was out much further. And where Duxbury went out much further, particularly off Chatham, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard. The land was totally different. And 13,000 years ago, mammoths lived in this area. Recently in Connecticut, there was an archaeology dig that had mammoth bones with human interaction and showed that mammoths and humans lived in our area. And at the bottom here, this is a mammoth tooth that was taken up in the Cape Cod Canal. And this point on the right was found on a beach in Chatham and is over 13,000 years and is the type of paleo point used to kill a mammoth. And right here is where our present Duxbury Beach is. This is where Duxbury Beach used to be. And this showed the land out about 14, let's see, this one is 14,000 years ago. And if you notice, Clark's Island was bigger in the past than it is now. And also behind Clark's Island, the Jones River, there was an ancient glacial lake, Taunton. And the glacial Lake Taunton took up the whole Jones River area and covered areas. And people started moving in during that time period. You could see Cape Cod Bay was different. And where we live now was called Pawtuxet. And Pawtuxet was the whole bay. Marshfield was Mississauga, part of the Massachusetts tribe. And there's often a naming of Duxbury as Matakeesit. Duxbury used to go all the way, Pembroke was part of Duxbury, and Matakeesit was the North River, and the North River used to start at Green Harbor, and the Great Portland Storm of 1898 right here opened up the North River. But before, it started in Green Harbor, wound its way all the way back to the ponds, Furnace Pond, etc., up in what is now Pembroke. And Matakeesit was this whole area. Pawtuxet was the whole bay. This area was Mississauga, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing things wrong. This is the Monpont Path, which was from the Jones River and is currently Route 106. And this is the Nemasket Path, which led to Town Brook and Plymouth. And the Nemasket Path is currently Route 44. So in what is formerly Pawtuxet, which is now Kingston, Plymouth, and Duxbury, there are 262 Native American archaeological sites and 23 broad areas. Kingston, 65 sites, 5 broad areas, Plymouth, 160. I won't go through them all, but there's many, many sites of archaeology in our region. And there's also submerged sites because of the land going out further. And here's Clark's Island, right here. Clark's Island faces Standish Shore. There have been many Native American artifacts found on Standish Shore, all along Bay Road, the most at Bay Farm and Rocky Nook, and all along the Jones River. So Clark's Island faced a very large settled population for thousands of years of Native American habitation. This, I didn't post the official archaeology map of the area because the Mass Historic Commission doesn't want people digging for artifacts. So I just highlighted in red some of the areas where there's have been major archaeology finds at the beginning of the Jones River. One of the largest, Bay Farm and Rocky Nook, but all the way back here. And recently, a 10,000-year-old artifact was found at the Hallsbrook Swamp, and a 10,000-year-old artifact was found on Bay Road. These are some of the Bay Farm artifacts. Most amateur collectors of the last 150 years have gone to Bay Farm and collected thousands of artifacts. They're ancient artifacts right up to contact period with the 1600s. Fishing tools, corn pestles, all sorts of tools. And this talk won't be a professional archaeology presentation of specifics of archaeological points. I'm not a professional archaeologist. I'm what's called an avocational. And I don't think it's a scientific presentation tonight. It's more about Clark's Island. This is Rocky Nook artifacts, and Rocky Nook artifacts, along with fishing points and plummets, also have these really big spears, very large, and they're serrated. They're mainly from the Archaic period, which is 3 to 6,000 years ago. Middle Archaic is the most prominent in our time period for our towns. And I think the size of these artifacts on Rocky Nook have to do with the size of fish. And before the 1900s, cod in Cape Cod Bay were ginormous. You can see the pictures here, how big codfish were. And if you can imagine being on a mashoon, which is a wampanoag canoe, spearing one of these things, you would have to have really big spear points to capture a fish like this. So in looking at ancient artifacts, you have to look at and think of the size of the fish. Now, I'm going to diverge a little bit and talk about a subject that will relate back to Clark's Island, and it's called Google Maps ghosting. And Google Maps now does layers, and the layers go down to the seafloor, and you can actually see things that aren't there anymore that show up on Google Maps. And for instance, this is the Windsor Brothers double wharf off Washington Street. This is a painting from 1793. This is Long Point Lane and the Yacht Club. This is Josiah Windsor's house. And he and his brother Nathaniel Windsor had a double wharf. These are their boats in the bay and their boats out in the ocean, and they had a big fishing fleet. Well, the whole point of this is to show that on Google Maps, you can now see the double wharf and the whole Windsor area for their fishing fleets, even though when you walk down near the yacht club, you can't see them. And his brother, Nathaniel Windsor, has the house up on the hill, which is now the florist in the Island Creek development. You can also see on Google Maps now where old Duxbury Beach was and where the present day Duxbury Beach is. It's not a great picture, but if you go to Google Maps, you could see how far Duxbury Beach was out. And the point of this is to show that you can also see where old Clark's Island is on Google Maps. And Google Maps now shows the ancient shoreline of ancient Clark's Island. And Samuel D. Champlain visited our bay in 1605, and he drew a map of Clark's Island, which looks nothing like Clark's Island today. But if you do the Google ghosting map, in fact, it matches it exactly. I didn't bring it all the way up, but this whole outline matches the Google ghost map. And you could see what the shape of Clark's Island was as late as 1605 with Champlain. This is Saquesh, and now there's houses all along here. And this edge of Saquesh now has a low tide oyster farm. So obviously things have changed since Native Americans lived in these areas. On the north shore of Clark's Island, current Clark's Island, there's 2 clam middens of shells. And like the ones I worked on at Spectacle Island, these middens they're on private property, and they have clams that are layered through the years, and you can find artifacts in the clam middens, and they've never been studied as far as I know. Recently, or for the past 25 years, collector Eric Strom, who lives out in the Gurnet, has been going to the summer Clark's Island picnic sponsored by the Rural and Historic Society. This is Eric right here. And he has been collecting on the shoreline artifacts. And you could see this is John Daly, who is a reenactor of the shallop, the Pilgrim shallop, but you could see in the background the erosion on the east side. This is the east side right here. And this is old Clark's Island. And then you could see the island is slowly eroding. And I talked to Mrs. Taylor, who has a house right here. And she said that the front of their property, they're actually getting land added. So the island is changing shape and changing shape over time. But all the artifacts that you can collect along the shoreline are along this eastern shoreline that's eroded and open. And there's a law called NAGPRA, Native American Grave Repatriation Act, Protection and Repatriation, and you're not allowed to dig on public lands. And if there's a grave site, you have to notify the local tribe, and there's people that work on these things. So, but you can pick up artifacts between the high and low tide on shorelines. And the artifacts Eric has picked up are all different eras and different time periods going back thousands of years, showing people living on Clark's Island. And some of the artifacts are made of materials that are from far away. This is a map that shows quarries of Native American artifacts like rhyolite, chert, etc., traded, where the original stone is located and where Native Americans have traded stones. So stones found on Clark's Island shoreline may have started out in upstate New York or Maine, and there's great trading of stones. Some of the artifacts are local quartz, all different time periods, fishing, spears. A lot of the points are that tips are missing, which means they probably were used to possibly spear a fish, were broken in the process, and their tips are missing on the shoreline because they were used. And there's plummets, points for tool making, points for hide. This is a drill. A drill can be used to make wampum. And as you know, Duxbury Beach has lots of quahog shells, and quahog shells, the purple and the white, were drilled and made into beads, very precise beads, and necklaces and belts. And they were a form of monetary, not quite, it's not the same as monetary, but they were very valuable. And drills could have been used on Clark's Island to make wampum. This is a ulu, which is a scraper. And women would use ulus in a bowl, just as you would today. I think Rubbermaid plastic spatula scrapers look kind of like this. An ulu was used to scrape a bowl, but it was also used to scrape skin off a fish, scrape deer hides, etc. And this is just another stone artifact, a large spear point from thousands of years ago found in the tide line. This artifact down here is called steatite, and it doesn't look like steatite up here because it went through a fire, a house fire out on the Gurnet. Eric Strom and his mother, Elaine Nudd, had a house fire and all the artifacts burned, but he recovered them. So this steatite piece has been through a fire, but originally was part of a steatite bowl. And steatite quarries are not on the shoreline. They're located in various places around New England. And they date before ceramics, before Native Americans were making things out of clay. This is a pre-ceramic bowl of 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, and pieces of it were found on Clark's Island. And the bowls are very heavy, and they may signal a period when the region was transitioning from mobile hunter-gatherers to more sedentary life. all artifacts in New England have been typed and dated through years of archaeologists comparing soil types and where artifacts are found. And the best thing to do with an artifact is to leave it in situ, in its place, and for people to understand the soils and for people to study it. But things washed up on shore, obviously you can't do that. But what is now available, this book is available at the Robbins Museum in Middleborough and online. And it has every New England artifact type found. And at the bottom, you can tell what the date is, what the material is, what the style is. So artifacts can be found all over Duxbury. And you can use this book if you find them in your backyard, in your wherever. They're all over Duxbury. And you can compare it and date it using this book, The New England Typology. It may be at the library, I'm not sure. But if it's not, it should be, Suzanne. And so did people always boat to Clark's Island, or was it connected to land? I can't answer that question because the map shows it connected to Duxbury Beach, but Duxbury Beach was out much further. So in the last 1,000 years, I would say that habitants went by Machoon. This is a Machoon, it's a large pine tree that's burnt in the middle through a process. And the front bough is very shallow to land in very narrow places. And this is a drawing from the 1600s showing a woman in the back of a Machoon and people paddling. And it's interesting, I was looking at a boat that a local fisherman used the other day, a Carolina skiff, and it has the same low front to land around Duxbury Bay that the Machoons from this area have also. And this is a 1605 map from Samuel D. Champlain, and it shows Machoons in our bay, Clark's Island, and clearly Machoons were used every day in our bay, as in our bay now, boats every day. So the Wampanoag had 64 villages in our area, all the way to Nauset, to Rhode Island, and across. And they traveled freely between winter hunting grounds, spring alewife runs, summer fishing grounds, fall deer hunting, food preservation for winter sites, and homes could be packed up in one day, and tribes sometimes traveled 40 miles to a new site in one day. Bay Farm was a summer encampment, spring, summer, fall, and I would guess that Clark's Island, like it is today, was mainly a spring, summer, fall encampment, and I would imagine it wasn't used in the winter, but I can't verify that. So without any professional archaeological studies, there's evidence that people lived in what is now known as Clark's Island for thousands of years, probably 10,000 years because of the closeness to the Jones River, which has multiple 10,000-year-old artifacts. But at least 8,000 years ago, people visited Clark's Island, not in its current shape. Other people who collected artifacts from Clark's Island was Dr. Herman Carey Bumpus. He bought the King Caesar House, and the wharf at the end of the King Caesar House had a large shack, and he used a boat he had built in Duxbury, beautiful sailboat called the Maya. The Maya was later bought by Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy sailed the Maya for 40 years, but Dr. Bumpus sailed the Maya from the end of the pier at King Caesar's house out to Clark's Island, collected artifacts, and stored them in the shed at the end of the pier. A friend of mine, Dennis Martin, remembers being a young boy with his father, going to the pier and going into the shack and seeing I think he said more than 1,000 artifacts from Clark's Island. And I tried to look up Dr. Bumpus's estate, which was given to Brown University, Harvard University, I believe the Museum of Natural History in New York City. And nowhere could I find the artifacts from Clark's Island. But enough people have told me that he collected artifacts from Clark's Island to believe he did, but they're lost right now. Another person, a very interesting story to me, Peter Smith, the architect in Duxbury, his uncle, who they called Old John Smith, was a rum runner in the 1930s. And he used to, during Prohibition, hide liquor in the back river. And he lived off St. George Street. And that was his business. That was a lot of people's business in Duxbury during the Depression. And in his spare time, he would go out to Clark's Island quahogging, and he would find artifacts. And Peter shared that, actually 3 people shared that John Smith, when they entered his house, had hundreds of Clark's Island artifacts in his house. Also, no one knows where they are now. So Native people lived in this area, Pawtuxet, probably from 10 to 12,000 years up until the year 1618. This is again the Champlain map of 1605. And then in 1618, there was a great comet visible around the world to the naked eye. And it was visible September 6th through 25th of 1618. And later a historian, Nathaniel Morton, wrote, some of the ancient Indians that are surviving at this writing, and this is about 1640, do affirm that some 2 or 3 years before the first English arrived here, they saw a blazing star or a comet, which was a forerunner of this sad mortality, for soon after it came upon them in extremity. And a plague came to the coastal New England, and some villages lost 100% of their inhabitants. Tisquantum, or Squanto, was a local 14-year-old boy, and he was captured as a slave, sent to Spain, moved to London, came back in 1619 and found his whole village dead. And then a year later, the Pilgrims came in 1620, and Edward Winslow wrote, there's a great deal of land, it's planted with corn, it's all cleared, there's no trees, but there's no people. So in 1618, the Great Plague went from Maine all the way down to Narragansett Bay. But inland, some people survived it, and Pawtuxet, our bay, was totally devastated. So there's many chapters in Clark's Island's history. One that is very sad is King Philip's War. Now, King Philip's War was 1665, 66, and went up to 1678 in Maine. And the battles were ferocious. The highest mortality percentage-wise of any war in United States history. Mortality on both sides, horrible, horrible devastation. And there was a council of war established in Plymouth Colony, and they ordered that the Nemachuset Indians be speedily removed to Clark's Island and there to remain and not to depart from thence without license from authority upon pain of death. And it's been written, some people have written about this, not many. And where is Nemachuset? It's the North River. It's Nemachuset, this is Pawtuxet. This is Mass Historical Map. This is the Pawtuxet area, our bay and surrounding towns. This is Matakeesit, all the way up the North River and surrounding towns. And the other Matakeesits, there's a number of them around our area. One is on Martha's Vineyard, it's a herring run. One is in the Bass River in Yarmouth, it's a herring run. And one is in Barnstable. These are ancient villages, and it's a herring run. And Pembroke has an enormous herring run, one of the largest on the East Coast. And this area was called Matakeesit, which I believe means something to do with herring. Some people say place of many fish. I don't speak Wampanoag. I don't interpret the language. It's also been called Nem-Matakeesit in the court records. And it was part of the Massachusetts area. It was called Nem, Massachusetts. So all these three names are prescribed to this whole North River complex. And the Indians that were captured in King Philip's War, many of them were sent to slavery. And I just learned about all of this through studying artifacts on Clark's Island. But between 1492 and 1880, there was between 2 and 5.5 million Native Americans were enslaved in the Americas, in addition to the 12.5 million African slaves. And the most number of slaves of Native Americans was during King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676. And natives were sent to Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, the Azores, Spain, and North Africa. One slave was, as I mentioned earlier, Tisquantum, captured in 1614, but actually Columbus captured slaves. Verrazano captured slaves in the 1500s. In the early 1600s, people were capturing slaves. So slavery, capture of slaves is a sad story on our coastline since the late 1400s. During King Philip's War, Native boys older than 14 years old had to be shipped overseas for even the slightest suspicion of rebellion. And any Native boy over the age of 14 could not reside in Plymouth Colony. And then a study by a professor who's an expert on Native American enslavement at Brown University, Linford Fisher, he found that Native Americans, including non-combatants who surrendered during King Philip's War, they were also enslaved. And it was because they made money and the colony was poor, and they actually made money selling the combatants overseas. And it helped to reestablish the colony's money supply that they had used during King Philip's War. So in the history of Duxbury, written by Justin Windsor, he talks about this time of Clark's Island and Native Americans. And he said the Nemachusett Indians be speedily removed to Clark's Island. But he said that during the war, Clark's Island became an asylum for some of the praying Indians of the colony and protection. And that's been repeated as a story. But unfortunately, it's not true, in that Daniel Gookin, who wrote about the Matakeesit praying village, it was the Matakeesit of Bourne in Yarmouth that were praying Indians. And I won't go into the history of King Philip's War, but the praying Indians were Christianized by an Englishman, John Eliot, and then King Philip's War came. And some of the praying towns, they were saved. They were put out on Deer Island, but there's no history at all that the Pembroke Matakeesit were a praying town. And it was a confusion between the Matakeesit of Bourne and Yarmouth is another one. The Matakeesit of Yarmouth was a praying town. They were saved, and they ended up becoming part of the Mashpee tribe, which still lives today. But the Matakeesit in Pembroke and our local Matakeesit tribe that was sent out to Clark's Island was never saved as a praying town. After the war, all the land around Matakeesit was given to colonists, and within a year, a ship was built on the North River, and the next 100 years, 1,000 ships. There's a lot of plaques along the North River, and you may know a little bit about the history of the North River. 1,000 ships during the colonial era were built in this area that was formerly Native American Matakeesit. And before the war, there was about 500 Native Americans living there. And after the war, there was less than 30. So the notion that the Indians on Clark's Island were returned and saved as a praying town, unfortunately, is not true. And I don't know if they were sent to enslavement, but the rules at the time that they were put on Clark's Island, at the beginning of the war, only men were shipped off as slaves. And as the war went on and became more brutal, men, women, and children were all shipped off on slave ships. So during the time period they were on Clark's Island, they possibly were sent as slave ships, but they were never heard from again. Other possibilities of Clark's Island, there was 112 men and women, children sold to slavery in Plymouth Harbor, and they ended up in Cadiz, Spain. And they talk about bringing them into the bay. And I don't know, and I can't say, does bringing them into the bay also mean putting them on Clark's Island? And then also there was 1,000 men that were, it says here in the court record, the United Colonies, we are going to put 1,000 men sent forth to send into the bay, and they were sent off as slaves. And then in July 1676, children were enslaved till the age of 24 for 24 years as servants to the English colonists, but also sent off with their families on slave ships. And on September 28, 1675, 178 Indians were taken by Captain Sprague, and they were taken from Plymouth Harbor on the ship Samson. The ship Samson was a gigantic ship that was built in Germany in 1647 for the Spanish, and it was used to transport West Indies cargo. It was captured by the British in 1652. Their gold was taken and made into British coins, and it was sold to a British mariner, Captain John Sprague, and then Thomas Sprague, and they outfitted this large ship as a slaving ship. They moved to Malden, Mass, and they visited Plymouth Harbor and took Native American slaves to Spain, to Barbados and Bermuda, and came back to Massachusetts all during the war. And there's lots of records of this. And how Clark's Island was involved in this, I don't know, but it seems that clearly Plymouth Harbor was involved in this. And then also there's lots more records about selling Indians, even Indians who surrendered were then sold for money. And during the war, the natives kept fighting because they didn't want to be sent to Barbados. And this is a quote from Native Americans that we don't want to surrender. We don't want to have peace to be made slaves and sent to Barbados. Let us live as long as we can and die like men, not to be enslaved. So there's records of Captain Sprague going into Plymouth Harbor, taking Indians and going to Barbados. But in 1665, there was a major hurricane on Barbados, and there was a slave rebellion of African Americans. And so in 1676, they passed an act prohibiting any Native Americans from the New England War to be brought into Barbados, because they found that the Native Americans that were from Plymouth Harbor were warriors, and they might add further to the slave rebellion. So all the slave captains were asked to take all the Native Americans off Barbados and take them away. I was trying to figure out, where did the Clark's Island Native Americans end up, and ran into all these records. And then this is a quote from a New England merchant at that time. The English colonists kill as many as they can, and those that they take, they send away to Barbados, Nevis, Jamaica, Spain, and sell them. And then there's no record of Native Americans going to Bermuda, but because they were prohibited from going to Barbados, their original destination, and if this is a map of Bermuda, and this is the old slave port of St. George right here, and this is a little spit up island called St. David. And right now on St. David are hundreds of former slaves who have a oral history of being Wampanoag from King Philip's War. And the Wampanoag in Mashpee and Aquina go down now to Bermuda and have reunions with Wampanoags on St. David's. And what's interesting is King Philip's wife and son were captured. They were brought into Plymouth. They were brought before the court. They were, there was a debate about whether to kill them or sell them to slavery. They debated it. They decided to sell them for slavery for money. And they were supposedly sent to Barbados. But the oral history on St. David's is that King Philip's wife and son were on St. David's. So there's a need for further study on this, but it seems like the Wampanoag prisoners of war from Plymouth Harbor were sent to Bermuda eventually. And the proper study of ship logs and records has never been done of the Native Americans captured in slaves and sent from Plymouth Harbor and possibly Clark's Island. This is an outline of what the Samson, the ship that Captain Sprague, and this is people lying down, and he could hold hundreds and hundreds of slaves on these big slaving ships. This ship was enormous on these trips. So after King Philip's War, Clark's Island became the property of Duxbury, the property of Plymouth, the property of Plymouth again, public property, private property. And I'm not going to discuss, because it would take an hour, the complicated ownership history after King Philip's War of Clark's Island. But it's very complicated. It's actually very interesting. In 1969, Sarah Wingate Taylor gave the middle of Clark's Island, 18 acres, to the Duxbury Rural and Historic Society as a bequest, Cedarfield. And Sarah Wingate Taylor was a poet and an educator, and her family had lived on Clark's Island since the 17th century. She wrote a book on Clark's Island. She repeated the story of the Indians on Clark's Island being praying Indians and saved and sent back. but the records don't verify that, unfortunately. She did sponsor lectures and authors visiting Clark's Island. And every year there's a lecture on Clark's Island, and there's a public Clark's Island visitation annual picnic and lecture. And the big, gigantic boulder called Pulpit Rock is where the site of the lecture is every year. Fascinating lectures. If you ever get a chance to go out, every year a different subject. And Pulpit Rock is labeled, "On the Sabbath day we rested, 20th of December, 1620. And there's really no acknowledgement, except recently, of the Native American past on Clark's Island. And recently, the DRHS, Duxbury Rural and Historic Society, put on their website land acknowledgement. And I'm going to read this just because I find it very powerful what they did. A darker episode in Clark's Island history was its use as an internment camp for the local Native population during King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676. Despite little evidence of threat, Plymouth authorities feared a Native insurrection, and they voted to relocate over 1,000 people on the island, and there to remain and not to depart from there upon pain of death. With very few resources, starvation was inevitable. With this important history in mind, we offer the following land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge that Duxbury is located in the traditional lands of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts. These tribal nations inhabited this territory through various times in history, have a 12,000-year-old history of lasting connections to and stewardship of the unceded lands and waterways. They have endured a painful history of genocide, colonization, and historical misinformation, but they survive and flourish today, as is evident by their descendants. This acknowledgement statement is a simple but powerful way to show respect and a step toward correcting the stories that have erased Native American history, cultural, and ancestral homelands in Duxbury and across the region. It is a way to give honor to those tribal nations, past and present, and a voice to their truth, resilience, I can never pronounce that word, reciprocity, and sustainability. Let this land acknowledgement be an opening to all, for all, to contemplate a way to join the Native American struggle against systems for oppression, and to learn more, visit the Massachusetts Center. So this is very powerful that the Rural and Historic Society is starting to acknowledge the Native American presence on Clark's Island. And they say Duxbury, but actually Clark's Island is owned by Plymouth. I ran this presentation by the Wampanoag historian, Linda Coombs, and she wanted me to add that they still live here. And the Wampanoag still participate in southeastern Massachusetts, and they're still very active. And they would like to be involved in the history of Clark's Island. So in conclusion, what I found in studying Native American history of Clark's Island was the island was much bigger historically. The island has thousands of years of native artifacts showing fishing, tool making, etc. The plague of 1616 to 1619 killed the whole large local native population. The Pilgrims landed and famously named Clark's Island in December 1620. Captured native people, including men, women, and children, were put on Clark's Island in 1665 to 1668 during King Philip's War. Slave ships loaded many Native Americans in Plymouth bound for Spain, Barbados, and Bermuda from 1665 to 1668. And Clark's Island today is enjoyed as a private summer house island, and 18 of the 90 acres belong to the Duxbury Rural and Historic Society land, including Pulpit Rock, and is open for the summer visit. And I have been going up to Clark's Island my favorite thing is to do photography out there and to capture all the yearly lectures and people visiting and the wonderful time. And that's the end of my lecture. Thank you for listening. And I think Suzanne said, if you have any questions in the chat line. Also, I'd like to point out that a lot of the history of Clark's Island is well known in the colonial period, and one can only guess about the Native American period by the artifacts. And the records about enslavement and Clark's Island during King Philip's War are not studied very well, and they need to be studied more. And I also would encourage an professional archaeological study of Clark's Island and involvement with the Wampanoag in commemorating the Native American past. So I guess, Suzanne, if you want to open it up, should I open up the chat line? Let's see. Is there, Jane Guitart to everyone, is there a possibility to do an actual guided, non-invasive tour of Clark's Island? Well, the middle 18 acres is owned not publicly, but by the open to the public DRHS annual picnic. The other acreage is private. It's not open to the public. Excuse me, I just have to take a sip of a tea. It's not open to the public. So you could take a boat tour of the island. Different families own different plots. There's been lawsuits over boundaries. There's a real need for privacy for the private owners. So it would be up to the private owners whether it was open to the public to do a whole tour. But I would encourage you to join as a membership to DRHS and do their annual August picnic. It's really beautiful. JM, what is the praying town you mentioned? The praying town is the Matakeesit praying town that Daniel Gookin writes about in 1680, which is Matakeesit down in Barnstable. And there's another Matakeesit in Yarmouth. And they were written about as praying towns, and they were actually saved during King Philip's War, and over time came to encompass the current Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. Jane, to everyone, any future talks, would it be possible to get Wampanoag input also? I did this presentation to Linda Coons, who's the chief Wampanoag historian for the Quina tribe, yesterday. I always get my talks reviewed by Wampanoag in case I'm doing something insulting, which I have great possibility of doing. And she would love to be involved. And before the COVID pandemic, the Wampanoags wanted to do a Machoon trip from Plymouth out to Clark's Island, and asked Aaron Mago, who was the former executive director of DRHS, got approved, COVID hit, it got stopped. So there's Wampanoag interest in doing a Machoon trip out to Clark's Island. And now there's a new search for a new executive director of DRHS. And that's going to take a few months. And it will be up to the new executive director how they want to work with the Wampanoag. I'm just doing this lecture. Any Wampanoag DRHS interaction would have to be between them, but I am trying to serve as a go-between. JG wrote, land acknowledgement is a very welcome statement. I agree. It's so interesting, the history, and the land acknowledgement is so interesting. Joy Mills wrote, thank you very much. I really enjoy it. There's more messages here. Let's see if I can do it. 2 more messages. How was the island named? NH, whoever you are, asked, how was the island named Clark's? Clark was the first mate on the Mayflower. And the Mayflower, as you know, came over in November of 1620, landed at First Encounter Beach, went up to Provincetown. They were looking for a place to have their settlement. And on December, they took the shallop, which is the smaller boat, off the Mayflower to look for a place. And the Mayflower was still anchored off the Cape. And I believe, I'm trying to remember, is it John Clark was the first mate? I forget. Anyways, Clark was the first mate on the Mayflower, got on the shallop. So when they landed in a storm in the middle of the night, kind of crashed. They lost a rudder and they crashed on the island. They woke up the next day. They had the first Sabbath, the Sunday, and the island was named since then for the first mate who helped steer the broken shallop into what's now Clark's Island.